The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the large front windows of Kendrick's grocery. Inside, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights buzzed softly above the aisles stocked with cans, boxes, and cartons. The store smelled faintly of freshly baked bread, a scent that always reminded Thomas Kendrick of better times. For nearly 40 years, he had stood behind the counter of this small corner shop, a fixture in a neighborhood that had changed more than he cared to admit. Thomas wiped his hands on a well-worn rag, his sharp eyes scanning the steady trickle of customers. He prided himself on knowing each one of them, the woman who always bought 3 oranges, never 4, and the young man who muttered to himself as he picked through the produce. But today, a stranger had entered the store, and strangers always unsettled him. The bell above the door jingled faintly, announcing the arrival of a young man. He was tall and clean-cut, dressed neatly in a button-down shirt with a small backpack slung over one shoulder. His presence disrupted the rhythm of the store, though the man himself moved with quiet ease. He nodded politely at the cashier and grabbed a basket, his movements calm and deliberate. Thomas's gaze lingered on him. He didn't recognize the man, and that alone was enough to spark unease. New faces, Thomas thought, often brought trouble. As he watched, the young man wandered through the aisles, stopping occasionally to inspect an item before placing it in his basket. He pulled out his phone, tapping something on the screen before tucking it away again. Thomas frowned, leaning forward on the counter. His mind began to churn, a familiar tension tightening his chest. What was this young man doing with his phone? Texting someone? Taking pictures? The idea made Thomas uneasy, though he couldn't say why. You can't be too careful, he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the faint murmur of customers chatting nearby. Jamal Bennett didn't seem to notice the scrutiny. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the shopping list he had carefully prepared earlier that morning. Cereal, milk, soup, simple staples for a week that promised to be as busy as the last. He moved methodically through the store, occasionally jotting down a note in his phone. He liked lists. They kept things organized, predictable. As Jamal reached for a carton of milk in the refrigerated section, Thomas stepped out from behind the counter. His shoes clunked heavily against the tiled floor, the sound cutting through the quiet hum of the store. Jamal didn't notice the approaching figure until a sharp voice broke the silence. "What do you think you're doing?" Thomas asked, his tone louder than necessary. Jamal turned, startled. The carton of milk hung loosely in his hand as he blinked in confusion. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. "I said, what are you doing?" Thomas repeated, his eyes narrowing as he gestured toward Jamal's backpack. "What's in the bag?" Jamal's confusion gave way to a flicker of frustration. He held up the basket in his other hand. "I'm just shopping," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." Thomas crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "I've seen this before. People like you, sneaking around, trying to pocket something when you think no one's looking." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Jamal felt the weight of them settle on his shoulders. Familiar but no less cutting. He set the milk down on a nearby shelf, his hand tightening on the basket. "I'm not stealing," he said, his voice even. "You can check my bag if you want." Thomas waved him off. "I don't need your excuses," he said, his voice rising. "I've run this store for decades. I know what to look for." A few customers had stopped browsing, their attention drawn to the escalating tension. A woman standing near the produce aisle quietly pulled out her phone, the small camera lens catching the light as she began recording. Jamal glanced around, his chest tightening as he took in the scene. The stares, the whispers, the silent judgment, none of it was new to him. Still, it stung. He straightened his shoulders, meeting Thomas's glare head on. "You're making a mistake," he said simply. But Thomas wasn't listening. He stormed back to the counter, his hand reaching for the phone. He dialed quickly, his voice loud and authoritative. "I've got a shoplifter refusing to leave," he said into the receiver, his eyes fixed on Jamal. "Send someone over." Jamal stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing not out of guilt, but out of disbelief. He knew how quickly moments like this could spiral out of control. and the sound of sirens in the distance only deepened his unease. He gripped the basket tighter, his fingers curling around the metal handle. Around him, the store felt heavier, quieter, as though the air itself had thickened with tension. Minutes later, the police arrived, their presence casting long shadows across the tiled floor. As they questioned Jamal, his responses were calm, measured. He unzipped his backpack, revealing a notebook, a water bottle, and a set of keys. There was nothing else. The officers exchanged a glance before turning to Thomas. "Do you have any evidence he took something?" one of them asked. Thomas faltered, the confidence in his voice wavering. "Well, no," he admitted, his gaze darting toward the silent crowd. "But I know how these things go." A voice cut through the growing murmur. The woman who had been recording stepped forward, holding up her phone. "I've been here the whole time," she said, her tone sharp. "And all I've seen is a man shopping. This is ridiculous." The officers reviewed the footage, their expressions softening as the truth became evident. They turned to Jamal. "You're free to go," one of them said. Jamal nodded, his expression calm but resolute. He turned to leave, pausing just long enough to glance back at Thomas. "You don't know me," he said quietly, "but you judged me anyway." And with that, he walked out into the sunlight, his head held high, leaving Thomas behind in the suffocating quiet of his store. The morning after the incident, Thomas Kendrick sat at his kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside him. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the occasional chirp of birds outside the window. His phone buzzed again, another notification, but he didn't reach for it. He knew what it would say. It had been buzzing since last night, each vibration like a stone dropped into the stillness of his life. The video was everywhere now. The title alone was damning. Store owner accuses black customer of stealing without proof. Thomas hadn't watched it, though he could see it playing out clearly in his mind. Jamal standing there, calm and composed, while Thomas's voice cut through the air with accusations he hadn't been able to back up. He rubbed his temples, the tension behind his eyes building. He had been so certain yesterday, so sure of his instincts. But now the certainty felt brittle, like a paper shield against a storm. Down the street, Kendrick's grocery was quiet, too quiet. For the first time in years, there wasn't a line of early morning customers waiting for their coffee or bread. The store's bell, which usually jingled with a steady rhythm as customers came and went, remained silent. By mid-morning, Thomas decided to head to the store. He walked the familiar path from his house, his boots crunching against the gravel sidewalk. The air felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just the weight pressing on his chest. As he turned the corner, he saw them, a small group of people standing outside the store, holding signs. Their presence was quiet but deliberate. The signs weren't flashy, simple words painted in bold strokes. "Stop racial profiling. We deserve respect." Thomas's steps faltered. For a moment, he thought about turning back, retreating to the safety of his home. But pride, or maybe something closer to habit, pushed him forward. Inside the store, the quiet was suffocating. The aisles were nearly empty, save for one or two customers who moved quickly. Avoiding his gaze, Thomas busied himself behind the counter, straightening already straight receipts and wiping surfaces that didn't need cleaning. Anything to keep his hands moving, to distract himself from the sight of the protesters outside. He glanced out the window. Jamal was there, standing with the group, his posture relaxed but resolute. He wasn't holding a sign, he didn't need to. His presence said enough. Thomas turned away, muttering under his breath. "What do they want from me?" he asked the empty store, though he wasn't sure if he was angry at them or at himself. The silence didn't offer an answer. As the day dragged on, the cracks in Thomas's confidence began to deepen. A delivery driver arrived with supplies, hesitating as he handed over the clipboard. "Guess you've seen the video," the man said, his tone casual but laced with judgment. Thomas didn't respond, scrawling his signature quickly and waving the driver off. Later, a loyal customer, a middle-aged woman who had shopped at the store for over a decade, approached the counter. She didn't have her usual warm smile. Instead, her expression was tight, almost apologetic. "Thomas," she said quietly, placing her basket down, I've been coming here for years. But, what you did yesterday, what I saw in that video, it wasn't right. Thomas opened his mouth to respond. But the words caught in his throat. She shook her head, her voice soft but firm. I can't keep shopping here. Not until you make this right. She left without her groceries. And the sound of the bell as the door closed behind her echoed in the empty space. Thomas stared at the counter, his hands resting on its edge. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: doubt. That evening, as the last slivers of daylight faded from the sky, Thomas sat alone in his store. The shelves seemed to mock him with their stillness. The faint hum of the refrigerators the only sound in the room. He thought about Jamal's words. You don't know me. But you judged me anyway. It wasn't the first time Thomas had judged someone, he could admit that much. But he had always told himself it was about protecting his store. About keeping things in order. It was just good business, he thought. But now, with the store nearly empty and his reputation unraveling, those justifications felt hollow. Outside, the protesters were still there, their silhouettes barely visible against the fading light. Thomas watched them for a long time, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. Was it anger, regret, or just the uncomfortable feeling of being wrong? He wasn't ready to answer that question, not yet. Instead, he locked the door and walked home, the silence of the empty street pressing against him like a weight. Behind him, the store stood dark and still, a quiet monument to the choices that had brought him to this moment. The days following the incident settled over the neighborhood like a heavy fog. Kendrick's Grocery, once a hub of quiet familiarity, had become a point of quiet contention. The protesters remained, their numbers ebbing and flowing with the hours, but always present enough to remind Thomas Kendrick of their message. This isn't just about you. Thomas spent most of his time behind the counter, pretending to ignore the small crowd gathered outside. He told himself he had work to do, inventory to manage, shelves to stock, but the truth was, the work didn't fill the silence like it used to. The store felt hollow now, the absence of regular customers creating an unfamiliar stillness that gnawed at him. Occasionally, a customer would venture inside, their footsteps hesitant as they moved through the aisles. Some avoided eye contact entirely, placing their items on the counter without a word before hurrying out. Others, like the woman from the day before, spoke their disappointment plainly. You need to fix this, Thomas, one elderly man said, his tone more tired than angry. He didn't wait for a response before turning and leaving, the doorbell's jingle lingering in the air. Thomas found himself pacing the store during these moments, the walls of the small space pressing in on him. Outside, the protesters continued, their quiet persistence like a drumbeat he couldn't ignore. Among them was Jamal Bennett, the young man at the center of it all. Jamal didn't shout or wave a sign, he simply stood with them, his calm presence drawing the eyes of passers-by. For Thomas, it was a bitter pill to swallow. He had built this store from nothing, working long hours and sacrificing more than he cared to admit to keep it running. He had always believed he was a man of integrity, someone who looked out for his community. And yet here he was, on the other side of their anger. Late one afternoon, Elena Rivera, his former cashier, joined the protest. Thomas watched through the window as she greeted Jamal and took her place among the others, holding a sign that read, "Respect for all." It felt like a betrayal. He had hired Elena when she was just a teenager, giving her a job when no one else would. She had worked at the store for nearly 2 years before leaving for college. He thought they had parted on good terms. Seeing her now, standing against him, stung in a way he hadn't expected. When the crowd thinned later that evening, Thomas stepped outside, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Elena was still there, talking quietly with Jamal. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm but unyielding. "Elena," Thomas began, his voice sharper than he intended. "What are you doing out here?" She didn't flinch, standing up for what's right. She said simply. Thomas's brow furrowed. "I gave you a job when no one else would. Is this how you repay me?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone remained measured. "You gave me a job. Yes. And I was grateful for that. But that doesn't excuse what you did to Jamal or the way you've treated people for years." I was protecting my store. Thomas shot back. That's my right. Elena tilted her head, her expression softening just enough to show a flicker of sadness. Was it protection? Or was it fear? She asked. Because all I've seen is you making assumptions about people about who you think belongs here and who doesn't. Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Thomas opened his mouth to respond but found he had nothing to say. Elena didn't wait for a reply. She nodded once, then turned back to the group, leaving Thomas standing alone on the sidewalk. The encounter lingered with him as he locked up the store that night. He replayed her words over and over in his mind, each repetition chipping away at the defenses he had built around himself. Fear, she had said. Was that what had driven him? At home, Thomas sat in his dimly lit living room, the glow of his phone screen illuminating his face. Against his better judgment, he opened the video of the incident for the first time. It was hard to watch, his own voice ringing out with an authority that now felt hollow. He saw Jamal's calm demeanor, the disbelief in his eyes, and the quiet judgment of the customers who had witnessed it all. By the time the video ended, Thomas felt a strange mix of emotions: shame, anger, and something else he couldn't quite name. He wanted to blame Jamal, or the protesters, or the changing times that seemed to leave men like him behind. But deep down, he knew none of that was true. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the store early, the streets still cloaked in the quiet of dawn. He stood behind the counter, staring out the window at the empty sidewalk. For the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong not just about Jamal, but about everything. The thought was unsettling, like the first tremor of an earthquake. But it stayed with him as the day went on. Outside, the protesters returned, their voices a quiet reminder that the world was watching. And for the first time, Thomas wondered if he was ready to listen. The air was heavy with the warmth of late afternoon as Thomas Kendrick stood behind the counter of his store, staring out at the group of protesters across the street. Their presence had become a part of his daily routine, like the hum of the refrigerators or the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. Yet, no matter how long they'd been there, he couldn't seem to get used to them. Today, they seemed quieter. The chants had softened to murmurs, and a few protesters sat on folding chairs, fanning themselves against the sun. Jamal Bennett stood among them, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He didn't look angry, Thomas thought. If anything, he looked tired. Thomas exhaled deeply and turned his attention back to the store. The bell above the door jingled, and a woman entered, her steps hesitant. She picked up a basket but didn't move far, her eyes darting to the counter where Thomas stood. He forced a smile, though it felt hollow. She didn't return it. After a moment, she put the basket down without a word and left, the bell jingling again as the door swung shut. Thomas watched her go, the familiar sting of rejection settling over him. It had been like this for weeks now, customers coming in, taking a few cautious steps, then leaving empty-handed. It wasn't just the store, though. Something deeper was shifting, and Thomas could feel it in the quiet moments when the weight of everything pressed against his chest. He had always believed in the rules he set for himself, the boundaries that kept his world orderly and safe. But now, those rules felt smaller, weaker, as though they were crumbling under their own weight. He wiped his hands on his apron and glanced outside again. The protesters hadn't moved, but their presence felt different today. Less like an obstacle and more like a question he didn't know how to answer. With a sigh, Thomas grabbed his keys and stepped out the door. The air was thick and warm, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. As he crossed the street, he felt every pair of eyes turn toward him, their gazes sharp but silent. When he reached the edge of the group, Jamal looked up. His expression didn't change, but his posture shifted slightly, his shoulders straightening. The others fell quiet, their murmured conversations fading into stillness. "I need to talk to you," Thomas said, his voice low but steady. Jamal studied him for a moment, his dark eyes searching for something Thomas couldn't name. Then, with a small nod, he stepped away from the group, motioning for Thomas to follow. They walked a few paces down the street, far enough to have some privacy but still within view of the others. Jamal leaned against a lamppost, crossing his arms. "What do you want, Mr. Kendrick? Thomas hesitated, the words he'd rehearsed in his mind suddenly feeling inadequate. He glanced down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of work, and then back up at Jamal. I think I might have been wrong, he said finally. Jamal raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral. Might have? Thomas's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to this being on the back foot. Admitting fault. I was wrong, he corrected himself, though the words felt heavy in his mouth. About you. About a lot of things. Jamal didn't respond right away. He tilted his head slightly, studying Thomas as though trying to gauge his sincerity. And, he said, his tone calm but firm. Thomas shifted his weight, feeling the heat of the sun on the back of his neck. I don't know what to do, he admitted. I thought I was protecting my store. But, maybe I was just protecting myself. Maybe I was wrong about what that means. For a long moment, Jamal said nothing. Then he exhaled, his arms dropping to his sides. Acknowledging it as a start. He said, but it's not enough. Thomas frowned, the words cutting deeper than he'd expected. What do you mean? Jamal straightened, his gaze unwavering. It's not about saying you're sorry. It's about doing something, about proving that you're willing to change. Words don't mean much if there's nothing behind them. Thomas nodded slowly, the weight of Jamal's words settling over him. What do you suggest? He asked, his voice quieter now. Jamal's lips pressed into a thin line as he considered the question. There's a food drive at the community center this weekend, he said finally. Come, volunteer, show people that you're here to listen, not just talk. Thomas blinked, surprised by the simplicity of the suggestion. A food drive? He repeated, as though the words were foreign. Yes, Jamal said. It's not about fixing everything overnight. It's about taking the first step. Thomas hesitated, the familiar tug of pride pulling at him. But as he looked at Jamal, at the quiet determination in his expression, the calm steadiness in his voice, something shifted. It wasn't resignation. Exactly. It was something closer to understanding. All right, Thomas said. I'll be there. Jamal nodded, though his expression remained guarded. We'll see, he said. Then he turned and walked back toward the group, leaving Thomas standing alone on the sidewalk. The walk back to the store felt longer than usual, the silence stretching out around him like a heavy blanket. But as Thomas stepped inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks, a flicker of possibility. Faint but persistent. For the first time, he wondered if the road ahead wasn't just about fixing his store, but about fixing himself. He wasn't sure how to start, but he knew one thing. He had to try. Saturday morning arrived with a soft gray sky and the promise of rain. Thomas Kendrick stood by his car in the empty parking lot of the community center, his hands resting on the trunk. The engine's warmth still radiated faintly, but Thomas felt cold, his nerves churning. The trunk was filled with canned goods, boxes of pasta, and jars of peanut butter, items he'd quietly taken from his store's shelves the night before. It wasn't much, he thought, but it was a start. The building ahead of him bustled with quiet energy. Volunteers in brightly colored vests moved in and out, carrying boxes and chatting with one another. It struck Thomas how natural it all seemed. This sense of shared purpose. He shifted his weight uneasily. He didn't know if he belonged here. After a moment, he reached for the first box, his fingers trembling slightly as they gripped the edges. The box was heavier than it looked, but he carried it toward the building, forcing himself to take each step slowly and steadily. As he approached the door, a volunteer noticed him and held it open, offering a polite but neutral nod. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the faint scent of coffee and the sound of voices mingling over the rustle of packaging. Tables lined the walls, stacked with food donations. A group of volunteers sorted through the items with practiced efficiency, their movements quick but unhurried. Mr. Kendrick. The voice came from his left. Calm and measured, Thomas turned to see Jamal Bennett standing by one of the tables, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. His expression was unreadable, though his gaze was sharp, as if he were trying to gauge Thomas's purpose. Thomas set the box down on the nearest table, straightening with a small groan. His back ached more than it used to these days. Morning, he said, his voice gruff but quiet. Jamal raised an eyebrow. Didn't think you'd show. Thomas glanced around the room, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I said I would, he replied, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. He wasn't sure if he was here for them or for himself. Jamal nodded slowly, his expression softening just a fraction. All right, then, he said. He motioned toward a stack of boxes near the back of the room. We could use an extra pair of hands over there. Thomas nodded, grateful for the clear direction. He moved toward the boxes, his steps deliberate, and set to work sorting cans and cartons into neat piles. It wasn't difficult, but the repetitive motion gave him something to focus on, something to steady his restless thoughts. As the morning went on, the room began to fill with people, families, seniors, and young children, their voices weaving together in a quiet hum. Some moved with purpose, their faces set with determination, while others lingered hesitantly near the edges of the room. Thomas watched them out of the corner of his eye, trying to make sense of the knot tightening in his chest. A young mother approached the table where he was working, her son clutching her hand tightly. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. Excuse me, she said softly, her voice almost lost in the noise. Is it okay if I take a few of these? Thomas looked up, startled. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Then he nodded quickly, stepping aside. Of course, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. The woman offered a faint smile. Thank you, she said. Her son peered up at Thomas curiously, clutching a small toy he'd found in one of the bins. Thomas gave him a nod, and the boy grinned shyly before walking away with his mother. The interaction was brief, but it stayed with Thomas as the hours passed. He found himself glancing at the other families, the way they moved through the room with quiet determination. They weren't here for handouts. He realized they were here for help, for a sense of stability in a world that so often felt uncertain. By mid-afternoon, the room had settled into a steady rhythm. The crowd had thinned, and the volunteers worked with practiced ease, their movements less hurried but no less purposeful. Thomas found himself stacking empty boxes beside Jamal, the two of them working in companionable silence. You did all right today, Jamal said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet between them. Thomas looked up, surprised. Thanks, he said, though he didn't quite know how to take the compliment. Jamal leaned against the table, his arms crossed. But one day doesn't fix everything, he added, his tone calm but firm. People are watching you, Mr. Kendrick. They're waiting to see if this is real. Thomas nodded, the weight of Jamal's words settling over him. I know, he said quietly. I'm not expecting people to forgive me overnight. I want to do better. Jamal studied him for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he nodded once. Good, he said. Keep showing up. That's how you build trust. As the last of the donations were packed away and the volunteers began to leave, Thomas lingered for a moment by the door. The room felt different now, filled with a warmth he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the people. He realized it was the purpose, the sense of connection that tied them all together. He stepped outside into the cool evening air, the faint scent of rain lingering in the breeze. The parking lot was nearly empty now, save for a few cars. As Thomas walked to his own, he caught sight of Jamal talking with a group of volunteers near the edge of the lot. Their laughter carried faintly on the wind, a reminder of the work still to be done. Thomas drove home that evening with the windows down, the cool air washing over him. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt open, like the beginning of something new. The morning air was still and cool as Thomas Kendrick pulled into the parking lot of the community center. The gray light of dawn cast soft shadows across the building, which already buzzed with activity. He parked at the far end of the lot, away from the few other cars clustered closer to the entrance. For a moment, he stayed in his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared out at the scene before him. Volunteers moved in and out of the building, carrying boxes and chatting with quiet purpose. Their bright vests stood out against the muted tones of the morning. A reminder that this wasn't just any Saturday. Today, they were here for the food drive, an event that promised support for some and tension for others. Thomas felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He wasn't sure which side of that divide he belonged to. The bed of his truck was loaded with supplies, cans of soup, jars of peanut butter, and boxes of dry pasta. He had packed them himself the night before. His hands moving with a mix of determination and doubt. It wasn't much, he thought, but it was something. With a deep breath, Thomas stepped out of the truck and began unloading the boxes. The weight of them pressed into his hands, grounding him in the moment. He carried the first box to the entrance, where a young volunteer greeted him with a polite nod. She took the box without a word, her focus already shifting to the next task. Thomas watched her for a moment, unsure whether to feel relieved or disappointed by her lack of recognition. Inside, the community center was alive with quiet energy. Tables lined the walls, stacked high with donations. Volunteers moved between them, sorting items into neat piles. The faint hum of conversation filled the air, punctuated by the occasional clatter of a box being set down. It was a scene of calm efficiency, one that felt foreign to Thomas despite its simplicity. "Mr. Kendrick." The voice came from across the room. Thomas turned to see Jamal Bennett standing by one of the tables. His arms crossed loosely over his chest. His expression was calm, though his eyes held a flicker of curiosity or maybe skepticism. "Morning," Thomas said, his voice gruff but steady. He adjusted his grip on the box he was carrying and set it down on the nearest table. "Where do you need me?" Jamal raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching as if holding back a smile. "Over there," he said, nodding toward a corner where a stack of unsorted donations waited. "We could use help organizing those." Thomas nodded and made his way to the pile, rolling up his sleeves as he knelt to examine the first box. It was filled with canned vegetables, each label slightly faded but still readable. He began stacking them into neat rows, his hands moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who had spent decades working with goods. The hours passed quietly, the room filled with more people, families, seniors, and young children, each one navigating the space with a mix of hesitation and gratitude. Thomas kept his head down, focusing on the task in front of him. But he couldn't help noticing the way the air shifted whenever someone approached the tables. The volunteers greeted each person with warmth, their words soft and reassuring. It was a kindness Thomas realized he hadn't practiced in a long time. At one point, a young boy wandered over to the table where Thomas worked. The boy's eyes widened as he spotted a stack of brightly colored boxes of cereal. "Can I take one?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked up, startled. The boy's mother stood a few steps behind him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She gave Thomas a tentative smile, her expression equal parts hope and uncertainty. "Of course," Thomas said, his voice softer than he expected. He gestured to the table. "Take whatever you need." The boy grinned and grabbed a box, clutching it to his chest like a treasure. His mother mouthed a quiet, "Thank you," before guiding him back to the other side of the room. Thomas watched them go, a strange warmth settling in his chest. It was such a small thing, he thought, but it felt significant. By mid-afternoon, the flow of people had slowed. The tables were still busy, but the room had taken on a quieter, more reflective energy. Thomas found himself working alongside Jamal, the two of them stacking empty boxes near the back wall. For a while, they didn't speak, the silence between them comfortable but charged. "You did all right today," Jamal said finally, his tone neutral but not unkind. Thomas glanced at him, surprised. "Thanks," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was meant as a compliment. "But one day doesn't change things," Jamal continued, his voice steady. "People are watching you, Mr. Kendrick. They're waiting to see if this is real." Thomas nodded slowly, the weight of Jamal's words sinking in. "I know," he said. "I don't expect anyone to forget what I did. I want to show them I'm trying." Jamal studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he nodded. "That's a start." As the last of the donations were packed away and the volunteers began to leave, Thomas lingered near the door. The room felt different now, filled with a warmth he hadn't noticed before. He watched as families walked out with bags of food, their steps lighter than when they'd arrived. It wasn't much, he thought again, but it was something. Outside, the sky had turned a soft shade of gray, the promise of rain still lingering in the air. Thomas made his way back to his truck, his steps slower than they'd been that morning. For the first time in weeks, The quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt open, like the beginning of a conversation he was finally ready to have. The store felt different now, though Thomas Kendrick couldn't quite put his finger on why. The aisles were the same. The shelves stocked with the usual staples. But the air carried a quiet tension that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the dwindling number of customers or the protesters outside, it was the weight of what had been broken. The trust that had once filled the space now replaced by doubt. Thomas stood behind the counter, his hands idly wiping down a surface that didn't need cleaning. The bell above the door jingled, and a middle-aged woman stepped inside. She moved with hesitation, her gaze darting between the shelves and Thomas. She was someone he recognized, though her name escaped him. She had shopped here for years, usually picking up a few small items after work. She walked toward the counter slowly, a basket in her hand. Thomas straightened, forcing a neutral expression onto his face. When she reached him, she set the basket down but didn't immediately speak. Instead, she looked at him as if trying to decide whether she could trust him again. "I wasn't sure if I'd come back," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "What you did to that young man, it wasn't right." Thomas swallowed, the words cutting into him with the precision of a blade. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "I know," he said, his voice low, "and I'm sorry for what I did to him and to anyone else who's felt unwelcome here." The woman studied him for a moment longer, her expression softening just slightly. "Sorry isn't enough. You know," she said, though there was no malice in her tone. "I know," Thomas repeated, "but I want to make things right." She nodded, picking up her basket again. "I'll hold you to that," she said before heading toward the back of the store. Thomas watched her go, the knot in his chest loosening just a little. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something, a chance. Maybe. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Later that afternoon, Thomas stepped outside to take a break. The sky was overcast, a thin layer of gray clouds filtering the sunlight into a soft glow. Across the street, the protesters stood in their usual place, their signs steady in their hands. Their presence no longer made his stomach churn with frustration, though it still carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Jamal Bennett stood near the edge of the group, talking with a young woman holding a clipboard. He glanced up as Thomas approached, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Kendrick," Jamal said, his tone polite but guarded. "What brings you over?" Thomas hesitated, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "I wanted to talk," he said, though the words felt clumsy in his mouth. "About the store. About what I can do to make things better." Jamal raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Better how?" Thomas sighed, glancing back at the quiet storefront behind him. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that it's not just about saying I'm sorry. That I need to show people I mean it." "And?" Jamal prompted, his tone even. "I was wondering if you had any ideas." Thomas admitted. The admission felt heavy, like laying down a shield he'd been carrying for too long. "What can I do to help the community? To earn back their trust?" Jamal's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before settling into thoughtfulness. He glanced over his shoulder at the group of protesters, then back at Thomas. "You really mean that?" "Yes," Thomas said simply. "I do." Jamal nodded slowly, unfolding his arms. "All right," he said. "Let's start small. There's a neighborhood cleanup happening next weekend, organizing supplies, picking up trash, planting flowers. It's something we do every year." Thomas blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. It was so ordinary. "You think that'll make a difference?" "It's not about grand gestures," Jamal said. "It's about showing up, being part of the community instead of standing apart from it." Thomas nodded, the words settling over him like a gentle weight. "Okay," he said. "I'll be there." Jamal offered a small, cautious smile. "Good. We'll see you there. Blank. Underscore. Blank." Over the next few days, Thomas began to make quiet changes around the store. He set up a small community board near the entrance, where people could post flyers for events, job listings, or services. He reached out to local suppliers, ordering fresh produce and staples he hadn't stocked in years. It wasn't much, but it was a step away to show that he was serious about making the store a place for everyone. The bell above the door jingled more often now, though the customers who entered still moved cautiously, their trust slow to rebuild. Thomas greeted each one with a quiet warmth, taking the time to learn their names and ask about their days. It was unfamiliar work, this act of connection, but he found it grounding in a way he hadn't expected. One afternoon, Elena Rivera, his former cashier, stopped by. She lingered near the community board, her fingers trailing over the edges of a flyer advertising a food drive. Thomas approached her hesitantly, his hands tucked into his apron pockets. "Elena," he said softly, "it's good to see you." She turned, her expression wary but not unkind. "Mr. Kendrick," she said, "I wasn't sure if I'd ever come back here." Thomas nodded, the honesty in her words cutting deeper than anger would have. "I understand," he said, "and I don't blame you. But I'm trying to make things right." Elena studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I hope you do," she said. "This place could mean a lot to the neighborhood if you let it." Thomas nodded again, her words staying with him long after she left. Blank. Blank. That night, as Thomas locked up the store, he felt the quiet weight of the day settle over him. The path ahead still felt uncertain, each step slow and deliberate. But for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Kendrick's grocery, casting long, golden rays across the quiet aisles. Thomas Kendrick stood near the entrance, staring at the newly mounted community board. It was simple, a cork panel surrounded by a modest wooden frame, but already colorful flyers and handwritten notes had begun to fill its surface. He ran his hand along the edge of the board, his fingers brushing against a flyer advertising a neighborhood cleanup, the very event Jamal had mentioned. His name was on the list of volunteers, written in neat, blocky letters. It felt strange to see it there, among the names of people who had once been strangers to him. Thomas stepped back and turned his attention to the store. Over the past week, he had made small but noticeable changes. The dusty shelves now gleamed with a fresh coat of polish, and the aisles were stocked with fresh produce, bags of rice, and even a section dedicated to local goods, jars of honey, handmade candles, and bags of roasted coffee beans from a nearby roastery. The changes were practical, yes, but they also carried a quiet message. This place is for everyone. Blank. The bell above the door jingled, pulling Thomas from his thoughts. A mother and her young son entered, their footsteps hesitant as they moved toward the shelves. Thomas recognized her from a few days ago, the woman who had approached him at the community center. She smiled faintly as their eyes met, though there was still a hint of caution in her gaze. "Good afternoon," Thomas said, his voice even. "Let me know if there's anything I can help you find." The woman nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said, before turning her attention to the shelves. Thomas watched them for a moment, then moved back to the counter. He busied himself with straightening receipts and adjusting the cash register, though his focus kept drifting back to the pair as they moved through the aisles. It was a small thing, their presence in the store, but it felt significant. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sign that maybe, just maybe, the tide was beginning to shift. Blank. Later that day, Jamal Bennett stopped by. He entered quietly, his tall frame casting a shadow across the counter as he approached. Thomas greeted him with a nod, setting down the inventory sheet he had been reviewing. "Jamal," he said, "good to see you." Jamal glanced around the store, his gaze lingering on the new produce section and the community board near the door. "You've been busy," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Thomas nodded, his hands resting on the counter. "Trying to make some changes," he said. "I know it'll take time, but I'm doing what I can." Jamal tilted his head, studying him for a moment. "That's good," he said finally. "People are noticing." Thomas raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "They are?" Jamal nodded. "It's not just the store. It's how you're showing up. At the cleanup, at the food drive, it's starting to mean something. But it's not just about being seen. It's about staying consistent." Thomas exhaled, the weight of Jamal's words settling over him. "I know," he said, And I plan to. For a moment, they stood in silence, the hum of the refrigerators filling the space between them. Then Jamal glanced at the chalkboard sign near the counter, where Thomas had written a message earlier that morning. Join us for Community Day this Saturday, all are welcome. What's this about? Jamal asked, nodding toward the sign. Thomas straightened, his tone quiet but firm. I'm hosting an event here in Open House. I guess you could call it refreshments. A chance to talk. Maybe even some suggestions from the community about how I can do better. Jamal raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That's a bold move, he said. Thomas shrugged, his lips curving into a faint smile of his own. It's the least I can do. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Saturday arrived with the crispness of early autumn. Thomas stood near the entrance of the store, adjusting the tablecloth on a folding table he had set up just outside. It was laden with trays of cookies, pitchers of lemonade, and a small stack of paper cups. A sign beside the table read, "Welcome to Community Day, your thoughts matter." The first visitors trickled in slowly, an older man in a worn baseball cap, a young couple with a stroller, and eventually, Elena Rivera. She lingered near the refreshments, her arms crossed as she surveyed the small gathering. Thomas approached her cautiously, his hands clasped in front of him. "Elena," he said, "thanks for coming." She gave him a faint smile, though her expression remained guarded. "I wasn't sure if I would," she admitted, "but I'm curious." Thomas nodded, his tone sincere. "I'm glad you're here." As the event continued, more people arrived. Some came to browse, others to talk. A few simply lingered near the refreshments. Watching quietly, Thomas moved between them, listening to their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes for the store. Each conversation felt like a small step toward rebuilding the trust he had lost. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. The tension that had hung over the store for weeks seemed to lighten, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. People laughed softly as they chatted, their voices blending with the faint music playing over the store's speakers. Toward the end of the day, Jamal approached Thomas. His expression was unreadable, though his tone held a hint of approval. "You did good today," he said, "but remember, this is just the beginning." Thomas nodded, the weight of Jamal's words grounding him. "I know," he said, "and I'm ready to keep going." Jamal extended a hand, and Thomas shook it firmly. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the beginning of something bigger, something that could last. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the storefront, Thomas stood by the door, watching as the last of the visitors left. The quiet that followed didn't feel heavy or empty. It felt like possibility. The first snowfall of the season came quietly, blanketing the neighborhood in a thin layer of white. Thomas Kendrick stood at the front window of his store, watching as flakes drifted lazily to the ground. The light from the street lamp outside illuminated the snow, casting soft shadows across the sidewalk. It was a peaceful scene, one that felt worlds apart from the tension of just a few months ago. Inside, Kendrick's grocery was warm and inviting. The shelves were full, the aisles neatly organized, and the air carried the faint scent of cinnamon and freshly baked bread. It was late, and the store had already closed for the day. But Thomas had stayed behind to prepare for the upcoming holiday celebration, a new tradition he had introduced after the success of Community Day. A table near the door was covered with small gift bags, each one tied with a bright red ribbon. They were filled with small treats, candy, tea, and handwritten notes of thanks. Thomas had spent the better part of the week putting them together, carefully choosing each item and writing every note himself. It was a small gesture, but one he hoped would resonate. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The following evening, the store came alive. Families, neighbors, and even some of the former protesters gathered outside, their voices blending into a quiet hum of conversation and laughter. String lights framed the windows, their soft glow spilling onto the sidewalk. A table set up near the entrance offered cups of hot cocoa and plates of cookies, free for anyone who stopped by. Thomas stood just inside the door, greeting each person as they entered. Some offered hesitant smiles, while others clasped his hand warmly, their eyes filled with gratitude. It was a stark contrast to the weeks of cold stares and empty aisles he had endured after the incident with Jamal Bennett. Jamal himself arrived just after sunset. His tall frame silhouetted against the soft light of the street lamp. He was surrounded by a group of teenagers from the community center, their chatter filling the air as they approached the store. When they reached the entrance, Jamal paused, his gaze meeting Thomas's. "Evening, Mr. Kendrick," Jamal said, his tone calm but warm. "Evening, Jamal," Thomas replied. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "Thank you for coming." Jamal nodded. Stepping inside, the teenagers followed, their excitement palpable as they made their way to the table of refreshments. Thomas watched them for a moment, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Blank. Blank. As the evening went on, the store filled with life. Children laughed as they played near the small corner Thomas had set up for them, stocked with books and toys. Parents chatted over cups of cocoa, their voices soft and warm. Even the older residents, who had been among the most skeptical of Thomas's efforts, lingered near the shelves, sharing stories and memories of the neighborhood. Thomas moved through the crowd, listening more than he spoke. He stopped to refill cups, straighten chairs, and answer questions about the store. It was quiet work, but it felt meaningful, a far cry from the isolation he had felt in the months before. Toward the end of the evening, Jamal found him near the counter, where Thomas was stacking empty trays. The younger man leaned against the edge of the counter, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. "You've come a long way," Jamal said, his voice low but steady. Thomas looked up, meeting his gaze. "Thanks to you," he said simply. Jamal shook his head. "You did the work," he said. "I just gave you a push." Thomas nodded, his hands resting on the edge of the counter. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but I needed it. This store, it's always been my life. But I see now that it wasn't enough just to keep the doors open. I needed to do more. To be more." Jamal studied him for a moment, then smiled, a small, genuine expression that carried more weight than words. "Well," he said, "you're doing it. Blank. Blank." As the evening wound down, the crowd began to thin. One by one, families and neighbors said their goodbyes, their footsteps crunching softly on the snow-covered sidewalk as they disappeared into the night. Thomas stood near the door, thanking each person as they left. When the last of the visitors had gone, and the store was quiet once more, Thomas sat down at one of the tables, a cup of cocoa in his hands. The string lights still glowed softly, casting warm patterns across the walls. He looked around the store, taking in the sight of the empty chairs, the scattered crumbs on the tables, and the faint smudges of snow tracked in by his guests. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, and work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. The journey hadn't been easy, and he knew it was far from over. But as he sat there, surrounded by the quiet evidence of progress, he felt a sense of purpose that had eluded him for years. This store, this community, it was more than a business. It was a connection, a chance to build something lasting. And for the first time, Thomas Kendrick believed he was truly part of it.